There is a habit that quietly consumes a lot of people's lives, and one of the reasons it is so dangerous is because it rarely looks dangerous at first. In fact, it often looks intelligent. It can look like responsibility. It can look like caution. It can look like maturity. It can even feel like progress. A person sits with a decision and tells themselves they are being careful. They replay a conversation because they want to understand what happened. They study every possible outcome because they want to avoid mistakes. They wait a little longer because they want to be sure before they move. And on the surface, all of this can appear wise. But sometimes what feels like careful thinking is not helping at all. Sometimes it is overthinking. And overthinking has a strange way of disguising itself as usefulness. It gives the mind something to do. It creates the feeling of effort. It can make a person feel engaged, responsible, and deeply involved in solving a problem. But while all of that is happening, something else is quietly happening too. Life is moving. Time is passing. Energy is draining. Peace is leaving. And the decision, the conversation, the change, or the next step often remains exactly where it was before all the thinking began. That is what makes overthinking so difficult to recognize. Unlike reckless choices or obvious mistakes, overthinking does not announce itself loudly. It does not always look like self-sabotage. More often, it looks like a person trying very hard to get life right. That is why so many thoughtful people get trapped in it. In this conversation, we are not going to reduce overthinking to a simple slogan like, just stop thinking so much. That would miss the deeper truth. Because the real issue is not thinking. The real issue is when thinking stops helping and starts quietly replacing action, peace, and trust in your own judgment. And once that pattern begins, it can take more from a person's life than they realize. If these conversations help you notice patterns in your own life more clearly, stay with us. That is exactly what this channel is here to do. Now let's look more closely at why overthinking so often feels productive, even when it is quietly stealing far more than most people notice. Part 1. One of the reasons overthinking becomes so powerful is because it often feels like work. A person may sit with an issue for hours, turning it over from every angle, and by the end of that time they feel mentally exhausted. Because exhaustion is present, the mind assumes something meaningful must have happened. It feels as though effort was made. It feels as though progress occurred. But mental effort and real movement are not always the same thing. This is one of the first quiet deceptions of overthinking. It can create the sensation of productivity without creating the result of productivity. Imagine someone facing a decision they need to make. It could involve work, a relationship, a move, a change in direction, or even a conversation they know needs to happen. They do not ignore the issue. In fact, they give it enormous attention. They consider different outcomes. They imagine what could go wrong. They analyze how other people might react. They search for the perfect sequence that would allow them to move without discomfort. From the inside, this feels responsible. They are not avoiding the issue, at least not in the obvious sense. They are engaged with it constantly. But there is a hidden problem. The more they think, the more the mind begins treating continued thinking as a form of action. And once that happens, the urgency to take an actual step begins to weaken. This is how people can stay mentally busy while their lives remain strangely still. Another reason overthinking feels productive is because it gives people the illusion of control. Uncertainty is uncomfortable for most human beings. Not knowing how something will unfold can create tension, especially for thoughtful people who care about consequences and want to make good decisions. So the mind starts working harder. It reviews the situation again and again, as though enough thought might eventually remove all uncertainty from the picture. But life rarely works that way. Many decisions do not become clear through endless thinking. They become clearer only after movement begins. Action reveals things reflection alone cannot reveal. Yet overthinking promises a different story. It quietly tells people that one more round of analysis will finally produce total certainty. One more review. One more possibility. One more imagined outcome. And because this feels careful, people stay in the loop longer than they should. Another hidden reason overthinking feels productive is because it allows people to postpone emotional risk while still feeling mentally involved. This is important. Sometimes the real fear is not the decision itself, but what comes with it. Discomfort, exposure, disappointment, regret, vulnerability, responsibility. Once action is taken, reality begins. And reality can challenge the version of events we were hoping for. Thinking keeps that moment at a distance. As long as a person is still working through it, they have not yet had to face the emotional consequences of movement. So the mind keeps circling, not always because the answer is unavailable, but because thinking feels safer than stepping forward. This is why overthinking is not always a sign of confusion. Sometimes it is a form of emotional delay that wears the clothing of intelligence. And because it looks so respectable, people rarely question it soon enough. They say they are being thorough. They say they are trying to be wise. They say they are waiting until they understand more. And sometimes those things are true. But sometimes the thinking has already crossed the line from useful reflection into quiet self-interference. If this kind of insight helps you put words to patterns you may have felt but not fully understood, consider subscribing and staying with us. There is a lot more we are going to uncover together. In the next part, we will look at what overthinking quietly steals from a person's life, not only time, but presence, peace, decisiveness, and the ability to actually experience life while it is happening. Part 2. Overthinking does not only steal action. It steals something even quieter before that. It steals presence. A person can be sitting in a room, driving to work, eating with someone they care about, or lying in bed at the end of a long day, and physically they are there. But mentally they are somewhere else entirely. They are revisiting what already happened. Or rehearsing what might happen next. Or trying to solve a future moment that has not arrived. This is one of the most overlooked costs of overthinking. It does not simply fill the mind. It pulls a person out of the life they are actually living and places them in a mental version of life that cannot be touched, changed, or fully resolved. And because that mental activity feels important, people often do not realize what it is costing them. They think they are being responsible. They think they are preparing. But all the while, ordinary moments begin passing by half-lived. Another thing overthinking quietly steals is decisiveness. The human mind was not designed to feel equally certain about every possible outcome. Yet overthinking creates the expectation that a person should not move until they feel completely sure. That is where many people begin losing their momentum. They imagine that wise decisions always come with a calm inner certainty. They believe that if doubt still exists, they must not be ready. So they wait. They think longer. They ask the question again in a slightly different form. They revisit the same issue from another angle, hoping that eventually the final missing piece will appear and remove all hesitation. But often that moment never comes. Not because they are incapable of making a good decision, but because certainty was never meant to arrive in the complete and perfect way they were demanding from it. A great deal of life requires movement before full clarity. And when a person keeps expecting clarity before movement, they can remain stuck in the same emotional and practical place for far longer than they realize. Overthinking also steals trust in your own judgment. This happens gradually. Each time a person keeps rechecking their own thoughts, reworking their own decisions, or mentally revisiting what they have already concluded, the mind receives a message. That message is subtle, but powerful. It says, your first judgment is not enough. Then the second judgment is not enough either. Soon even simple choices begin carrying more weight than they should. The mind starts behaving as if every decision must survive endless internal examination before it can be trusted. What began as caution slowly becomes self-doubt. And once that happens, overthinking no longer feels like a tool. It becomes a private atmosphere the person lives inside. Another quiet cost of overthinking is emotional fatigue. Thinking intensely about a problem can feel invisible from the outside, but the body often pays for it. A person may feel restless without understanding why. Tired even after a night of sleep. Irritated by things that normally would not have disturbed them. drained before the day has properly begun. This happens because the mind is not built to remain in a continuous state of unresolved internal tension without consequence. When thoughts circle the same issue repeatedly, the nervous system rarely treats that as harmless. It reacts as though something important is still unresolved. And because the issue remains mentally active, the body remains partially activated too. This is why overthinking can leave people exhausted even when nothing visible has happened. The life around them may appear normal, but internally they have been carrying a weight that never fully sets down. If these reflections help you recognize patterns that may be quietly affecting your own life, subscribe and stay with us. This channel exists to uncover the hidden habits and inner patterns that most people are living through without fully naming. The painful truth is that overthinking often steals from people in ways that do not show up immediately. It does not always create one obvious collapse. More often, it slowly reduces clarity, weakens energy, and makes life feel heavier than it needs to feel. In the final part, we will look at the turning point, how to recognize when reflection has become mental looping, and how people begin reclaiming peace, movement, and trust in themselves without forcing their minds into silence. Part 3. The turning point with overthinking does not begin when a person suddenly stops having complicated thoughts. That would be unrealistic. The turning point begins when they learn to recognize the difference between reflection and mental looping. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Reflection helps you move closer to clarity. Mental looping keeps you emotionally occupied without bringing you any closer to action, peace, or understanding. At first, those two things can feel very similar. Both involve thinking. Both can feel serious. Both can seem responsible. But they lead to very different places. Reflection usually brings movement. Even if the answer is not immediate, useful reflection tends to narrow the issue, reveal what matters most, or lead toward a next step. Mental looping does the opposite. It keeps reopening the same question without producing anything new. It circles the same possibilities, the same fears, the same imagined outcomes, until the mind becomes tired but not clearer. So the first skill people need is this. Ask one simple question. Is this thought helping me move, or is it only keeping me mentally busy? That question can interrupt a surprising amount of unnecessary mental spiraling. Because once you ask it honestly, you often notice something important. You are not discovering anything new. You are not getting clearer. You are not preparing more effectively. You are just staying inside the same mental room. The second skill is to stop demanding total certainty before action. This is where many thoughtful people lose years of energy. They wait until they feel fully ready, fully convinced, fully calm, or fully sure. But many decisions in life do not reward that approach. They reveal themselves through movement, not through endless mental rehearsal. So instead of asking, "How can I be completely sure?" ask, "What is the next honest step I can take with the clarity I already have?" That is a much better question. It brings the mind out of perfection and back into reality. And reality is where progress begins. The third skill is one of the most powerful. Set a boundary around thought. Most people set boundaries around time, work, or other people. Very few set boundaries around rumination. But overthinking grows wherever the mind is given unlimited space to reopen the same issue again and again. So when something genuinely needs reflection, give it a container. Take a notebook, a note on your phone, or even a quiet moment alone and ask yourself 3 things. What is the real issue? What part of this is actually in my control? What action belongs to me next? Write the answers down. Then stop. That last part matters. Stop. Because once the next action is identified, continued thinking often becomes a way of avoiding the discomfort of taking it. This is not about becoming careless. It is about refusing to let the mind pretend that endless reprocessing is the same thing as wisdom. Another powerful skill is learning to return to the present moment before returning to the problem. When the mind has been looping for a long time, it often becomes disconnected from the body and from immediate reality. So before solving anything, pause and come back. Notice where you are. Notice your breathing. Notice the chair beneath you, the room around you, the actual moment you are living in. Why does this help? Because overthinking usually feeds on imagined futures, rewritten pasts, and unresolved mental scenarios. Presence interrupts that pattern. Presence reminds the mind that not every problem needs to be lived 100 times internally before it is faced once in reality. And perhaps the deepest skill of all is this. Learn to respect a decision once you have made it. This does not mean you become stubborn. It means you stop reopening every choice just because discomfort appears afterward. A lot of people think the presence of doubt means the decision must have been wrong. That is not always true. Sometimes doubt simply means you are human, and you have moved into a part of life where certainty was never guaranteed. If these conversations help you think more clearly and live with more peace, subscribe and stay with us. This channel is built for people who want more than advice. It is for people who want to understand what is quietly happening inside their own lives. Because in the end, overthinking is not dangerous only because it fills the mind. It is dangerous because it can quietly replace living. And the moment you learn to notice that pattern, question it, and interrupt it with action, presence, and better questions, your life begins returning to you. A lot of people think overthinking is a sign that they care deeply, think seriously, or want to make the right choice. And sometimes that is true. But there comes a point when the mind is no longer protecting your life. It is postponing it. That is the line most people do not notice soon enough. They think they are buying safety, when in reality they are spending something far more valuable, their peace, their energy, their presence, and the courage to move while life is still in front of them. You do not get your life back by thinking about it forever. You get it back when you begin recognizing when thought has stopped serving you, when you stop mistaking mental noise for depth, and when you become willing to take one honest step without demanding perfect certainty first. That is where strength begins. Not in having every answer, but in no longer allowing your mind to keep you standing at the edge of your own life. If this conversation gave words to something you have been living through, stay with us. Subscribe, and share this with someone whose mind has been carrying more than it should. There are too many people silently losing years to patterns they never learned to name. And sometimes the first real change begins the moment a person finally sees clearly what has been quietly stealing from them all along.